Hi friends, welcome to my channel. My name's Fiddle. Today I'll be showing you how to make this bucket with a jumping fish, a bathtub, and a sitz bath with bubbles and a rubber ducky. And as always, don't forget to check the link in the description labeled Scavenger Hunt. That would take you to the list of materials and free printable patterns so you can follow along and make these tubs with me. Are you ready? Let's go. Before we get started, we have to do a little prep work to the pattern. As you can see, there's two pieces labeled bathtub. We need to tape or glue these pieces together so we can make the whole pattern for the bathtub. Because it was so large, I had to cut it into two pieces for it to fit on a normal size piece of paper. Once you have your pattern ready, trace it onto your final material. I used a thick watercolor paper to hopefully bring more texture, but in the end, I really don't think you could tell. Chipboard or poster board would be perfectly fine. Now that we have all of the pieces cut out, we can glue our ends together. I left them pretty long, so there will be a bit of an overlap, so you can decide on where you want yours to end. Trim off the excess and mark with your pencil where your ends meet up so you know where to glue. With your guidelines marked, glue the ends together on all three pieces. Set them aside to dry, and we're going to move on to making the bottoms. I traced a plastic cottage cheese lid as the base for the bathtub, but you can trace the bottom of the tub as it is and make it a smidge bit bigger so you'll end up with a lip and have room for error. For the bathtub, you will need two of these bottom pieces, one for the base and one inside as a false bottom. For the sitz bath and bucket, I found that my glue bottle was the perfect size. Because I was using a watercolor paper, I decided to double the layers up on the bottom of mine using chipboard. Once you have your bases ready, we can glue the sides on. And this is also where you would want to put your false bottom in before we start painting. To make sure that the sitz bath and bucket kept its shape while it dried, I used a silicone mold and a paint bottle to keep them in shape. Once everything's had time to completely dry, we can move on to painting. For this, you'll need some black acrylic and clear Elmer's glue. Add about 2 times as much glue as you did paint. Mix it well and paint the insides of the bucket and tubs. We'll be adding more to our mixture when we go to paint the outside. To add more texture to the outside, we're going to add some sand. The amount is up to you. I put in about 2 tablespoons. And to make sure our color stays opaque, some cornstarch. Mix it well and you're ready to paint the outside. One of the things I like to do while painting is think about the piece of furniture and the area it's going to be in and what kind of wear and tear it would have. In thinking along those lines, I decided that concentrating the sand around the bottom rim and the low points of the top rim would be good places to see corrosion. Let it completely dry for a day or so before moving on to the next step. Okay, now we're ready to give it its copper color. Unfortunately, I didn't have any copper paint, so I decided to mix some antique gold with some rose gold, and that kind of got me there. It was close enough for me. And I also used a sponge hoping to give more texture. And it did on the inside, but over top of the sand it really didn't make much of a difference. And a paintbrush will work perfectly fine. Once it's completely dry, we can add on our next layer. This time using a watered down green. And we're going to put it on the places where our sand is most concentrated. Let it sit for a minute, then come back with a towel or rag and dab the excess off. Repeat the process until you're happy with the way that it looks. Once you're finished with the green layer, we can move on to the blue layer, repeating the same steps and processes as we did for the green. Okay, now that we've got most of the outside layers, we're going to drip some paint on the edge down on the inside, just to give it a little more detail. And now we have one more layer to add to the outside, and that's just a watered down black. But this time we're going to put it all over and then use the paper towel to dab it away. This is what mine is looking like so far. With all of the painting done, we can move on to finishing the bucket. We're going to start with using a hand drill and drilling holes on either side of the bucket. Then cut a chopstick about 2 inches long, or as long as your bucket is wide. Then measure about a 1/4 inch away from both ends and put a mark. Then using your hand drill a hole at your markings, but we don't want to go all the way through the wood. Next, using a pair of pliers, make a letter J at the end of some floral wire. Then trim it about an inch long and make another one exactly the same. Then glue the long end of your wire in the holes we drilled earlier, making sure that the hooks are pointing outwards. I did use resin for this, but E6000 or some other strong multi-surface adhesive would work great. Then poke the wire through the holes that we made on the bucket and squeeze them closed with a pair of pliers. Okay, now that our bucket's made, we have to start adding the water. But first we have to decide on how we want our bucket to be sitting, whether we want it sitting flat on its bottom or tilted over on its side like I'm gonna make mine. While we're waiting for the water to cure, we can move on to making the splashes. For this I used white bristles from a paintbrush. For this I used long white bristles from a paintbrush, but fishing line or maybe even a jewelry line would work just as well. Using a single strand, dip it into the resin. It'll start to form little balls, then hold it in front of a UV light to cure it. Keep dipping and curing until you have it the way you would like. This is what some of mine look like up close, but you'll need about 15 to 20 of them. Okay, now we're ready to make it look like the bucket's tipped over on its side. Using a piece of plastic that the resin won't stick to, put down a decent sized drop, then set the corner of the bucket into it. Hold it in place while the resin cures. To give more support to the resin and splashes, I took a small piece of clear flexible plastic and taped it to the side of the bucket. And I apologize because I forgot to add that on the scavenger hunt. It's just going to be temporary long enough to support the resin while it cures. Now you can make it look like the resin is coming up out of the bucket. Unfortunately, while I was putting the splashes in, my head was in the way for most of it. Use super glue to attach the splashes, then resin to set them in place. Leave out about 5 or so splashes. We'll use them over top of the fish later. But real quick before we start the fish, let's add some resin to the bottom of the bathtub and the sitz bath. This time I'm using epoxy resin and I know that it takes longer to cure, and that will be perfect for the time that it takes for the fish and rubber ducky to cure. I did add a smidge of blue pigment to the resin this time, since these pieces are a little bit deeper and the bathtub having a false bottom, I wanted it to be hidden. Once you have your resin poured, set it aside and grab out your cold porcelain clay so we can make our fish and rubber ducky. We're going to start with making the fish. I made mine orange, but you can make yours whatever color you'd like. To make the fish's body, roll the clay in your hands until you have an oval shape. Then using a ball tool, shape out the lips. Press the clay lightly against the ball tool and use the finger of your other hand to roll the clay up and down the tool. Then in the center, make a divot. That makes the fishy lips. Then decide on where you want the eyes to be and make 2 more divots. This is what my little fish looks like up close. Now that we have his body made, we need to make his little fins. Start out with 2 balls of clay that are the same size. Set one aside and then split the other in half. Then using your finger, lightly smash down one of the tiniest balls. Then, using a pointed tool, drag lines from the center to the end. We kind of want it to look like a seashell. Then repeat the process for the other tiny fin and the tail. For the tail fin, once you have one side done, flip it over and do it on the other. Okay, now we're ready to attach the fins. Add a dab of glue to your work surface so that way it's ready for when you need it. Cut a curve in the end of the tail that's going to be attached to the fish and then glue it in place. And because not all of my fish's tail will be able to be seen, I trimmed it off flush with the body. To add the tiny fins, add a dab of glue to the side of the body where you want them, then lay the fin on top. Let them dry for at least 2 days before moving on to the next step. Here's what mine looks like up close, all finished. Now we can resin the fish to the bucket. I don't have footage of me doing it, but I did go back through and add a few more water splashes over top of him. You can see them in this photo. Now on to the rubber ducky. Start by rolling a small ball of clay into an oval shape. Then at one end, pull the clay upwards and to a point. Then use a pointed tool and drag it through the clay to make it look like feathers. Then make a small ball of clay that you think is the right size for the head, and then attach it to the body. Then use a ball tool to give it 2 eyes. Now we're ready for the wings. Start out with a small ball of clay and then split it in half. Then using your fingers, shape one of the small balls of clay into a rounded arrow. Then using a pointed tool, drag lines through your clay to make it look like feathers. Repeat the process for the other wing. Then glue them in place. Here's what he looks like so far. Now we just need to give him his beak. To make his beak, we're going to need a tiny bit of orange clay in the shape of a triangle. Use a rounded tool to give it a little bit of a curve. Then glue it in place. And this is what he looks like all done. I do come back later on after he's dried and use a black marker to give him eyes. Now let's move on to making bubbles. For this we'll need silica beads and iridescent fingernail polish. Using a tiny container that can be thrown away, mix up the silica beads and the fingernail polish. It will want to clump up and that's okay for right now. Once we have all the colors that we want in it, we can break them apart with our fingers and let them dry on something flat. this is what mine looks like up close. I did do individual batches with each color and then mix them together. To try to give the bubbles more of a frothy look, I used an opaque white fingernail polish around the edges and made circles in the center. Then add a very thin layer of resin over top of the polish. Then add the bubbles and use a tool to move them around to get them where you want them. And we can't forget about the rubber ducky. And I couldn't help but put some bubbles and water down the side of the tub and a puddle on the floor. Repeat the same process for the sitz bath. And with that, it brings us to the end of our tutorial. I hope this gives you some ideas for your next project, or you join me in making it. If you've made it this far, thank you so much. I really do appreciate you. If you're new, welcome. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment, as it all really helps me out a lot. Our next project will be this writing desk that closes up. Thank you, Ginger, and I'll see you next time.